Tonight, we walk back into the English countryside of 1845, an age of cholera burials, candlelit cottages, and fields that swallowed sound whole. In a village near Worcestershire, a widow named Eleanor Gray stepped into the fog with her husband's lantern. She never returned. At dawn, children found the light still burning on a stone by the marsh. Its flame steady while the footprints around it spun in frantic circles before ending in nothing. No body, no struggle, just silence where a woman had been. The constable dismissed her as lost to grief. The church called her a warning to women who strayed at night, but villagers whispered of a stranger in black, of screams cut short, of the lantern that reappeared in hedgerows for weeks afterward, swinging as though still carried by an unseen hand. They gave it a name, the widow's lantern. The law wrote her off. Folklore kept her alive. And 180 years later, we are still asking, was Eleanor Gray a ghost or the victim of a crime disguised as one? The first page of the widow's diary is not smudged with grief, but with ash, torn from its binding. Found in the hollow of a rusted lantern decades later, it reads in a jagged hand, "If I burn this light, he will find me. If I extinguish it, he will not let me leave. Either way, the dark is already chosen." That was 1845. Worcestershire countryside, a place of rolling green fields by day and suffocating silence at night. No one ever agreed who wrote those words. The widow herself, her hand shaking under candlelight, or someone who wanted her voice to linger like a ghost in ink. What the villagers did agree on was this: her lantern kept swinging long after her cottage stood empty. Travelers swore it bobbed in the marshes at midnight, drifting from one hedgerow to another, as if searching for something or someone. They called it the widow's lantern, a local folktale of loss, vengeance, and unfinished business. But behind that cozy rural ghost story lies a case that never settled. A woman known only as Eleanor Gray, widowed by the cholera outbreak, was last seen alive carrying her husband's lantern into the mist. She didn't come back. The police chalked it up to a lonely woman swallowed by the elements. The church suggested despair had driven her into the water, yet her neighbors muttered of screams in the fields, a shadowy rider glimpsed before her disappearance, and a trail of footprints that ended in circles, as if she had been chased around and around until something or someone dragged her into silence. What chills me isn't the ghost tale. It's the forensic cruelty of it all. Imagine circling in the night, your own prints betraying your panic, lantern bobbing while something you cannot see herds you like cattle. That's not folklore. That's a crime scene disguised as a haunting, and buried under a century of whispers and superstition is the more terrifying truth. The widow's lantern wasn't just an eerie light in the distance. It was evidence. England, 1845. You have to understand the landscape to feel the dread. This wasn't the bustling London of Dickens, where soot and gas lamps suffocated the poor. This was Worcestershire, hedgerows that box you in, fields rolling like waves of dull green, and a fog so heavy it felt alive. The Industrial Revolution was chewing through cities, but out here, time dragged like a plow through wet soil. By day, it looked quaint. Smoke curling from chimneys, cottages stitched into the countryside, the sound of church bells scattering across farmland. But at night, the whole place curdled. No street lamps, no steady glow from distant towns. Just black, thick, devouring black. And in that black, every sound mattered. A horse's hooves could mean a traveler or a thief. A branch snapping in a hedgerow could be the wind or someone crouched in the dark, waiting. Superstition thrived here. People still believed in corpse candles, in spirits bound to marshes, in ghost lights that lured wanderers into bogs. Folklore wasn't entertainment. It was a survival manual. When someone claimed to see a lantern swinging where no one should be, people didn't laugh. They prayed harder. And the law? Don't picture detectives with magnifying glasses. Rural constables were often farmers pressed into duty, more skilled at chasing chickens than solving crimes. If a woman vanished, they blamed grief, God, or her own weakness before they blamed foul play. Layer on top of this the cultural shadow of cholera. In the early 1840s, outbreaks carved through families like a scythe. Eleanor Gray lost her husband that way. People whispered that survivors were cursed, not blessed. The widow was pitted, but also avoided. Disease had stained her. Death clung to her skirts like damp earth. So when she disappeared, the parish didn't rally in outrage. They muttered, "Of course it was her. Death always takes the marked ones." That's the cruelty of the age. Some lives are considered expendable, and a missing widow barely scratched the surface of local gossip. But history has a way of leaving strange bruises. Every document I've traced, the parish notes, the constable's ledger, even that singed diary scrap, suggests something more than a lonely woman wandering into the dark. The environment around her wasn't just bleak backdrop, it was a stage designed for disappearance. Every hedgerow a curtain, every fog bank a veil. And on that stage, the widow's lantern became not only a story whispered to children, but a marker, a flare fire from the past, telling us someone didn't just vanish. Someone wanted her gone. Eleanor Gray. Even the name sounds like something carved into a headstone, doesn't it? But before she became the phantom at the edge of fields, she was simply a farmer's wife, ordinary in every sense, which is what makes her story sting. She wasn't a socialite, not a radical, not some tragic heroine out of a Bronte novel. She was a woman who baked bread before dawn, hauled water until her hands blistered, and stitched her husband's shirts by candlelight. Born Eleanor Cartwright. She grew up one village over in Stewartport, the daughter of a cooper who made barrels for the canal trade. Her childhood was uneventful, at least as much as poverty allows. She married young, like most did, to Thomas Gray, a man 10 years her senior, steady and dependable. He wasn't wealthy, but he was a farmer with decent land and a good reputation. By all accounts, Eleanor was content, if not happy. Happiness was a luxury for the poor. Survival was the only real occupation. Then cholera came, and cholera didn't care about reputations. It struck Thomas in the summer of 1844. He was gone in 3 days. The records are blunt. Gray, Thomas, farmer, taken with flux, deceased. Eleanor, barely 30, was left with a crumbling farm and no children. That detail always gnaws at me. No children. It meant she had no lineage to tether her to the future, no one to carry her forward. In a society obsessed with heirs and inheritance, that made her disposable. Witness accounts paint her as pale, distant, moving like a shadow through the village after his death. But here's the thing, grief doesn't always equal despair. Some said she kept to herself because of suspicion. Neighbors whispered that cholera lingered on her clothing, her breath, her very skin. One woman swore Eleanor's eyes looked like glass, as though she had already joined him. Another man claimed she walked the lanes at night, lantern in hand, not searching for anything, but pacing, as though retracing steps only she understood. She was a woman stranded in a world that had no place for her. Widows were burdens, especially childless ones. The church urged remarriage. Society urged silence. Eleanor chose neither. Instead, she clung to her husband's lantern, an object so ordinary, yet described in every account like it radiated significance. Not the brass, not the glass, not the soot-stained handle, but the fact of it, the way she carried it everywhere, as though it was the last proof she hadn't been erased. So yes, Eleanor Gray was ordinary, but ordinary lives don't vanish in the mist unless something extraordinary intervenes. And if the lantern was her anchor, then maybe, just maybe, Whoever or whatever took her understood that extinguishing the widow meant extinguishing that light. It began with sound, not sight. A shepherd returning from the fields swore he heard screaming near the marsh edge. Not the kind of scream that bursts and dies. No, this was staggered, ragged, as if someone was trying to run while crying out at the same time. When he rushed toward the noise, he saw nothing but fog. What he did hear, though, was the frantic crunch of boots in the wet soil, circling, 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 then silence. Later, children gathering kindling found the lantern. It was upright, still burning, set neatly on a flat stone as if placed with intention. The villagers said that was proof Eleanor had gone to join her husband. They argued she must have walked into the marsh. Heavy skirts dragging her down, body swallowed by mud and water. Convenient explanation. Too convenient. But here's the catch. Eleanor was terrified of the marsh. She told neighbors she avoided it after her husband's death, claiming it stank of endings. Why, then, would she carry her only companion, the lantern, directly toward it? Why abandon it burning, perfectly upright, as though staging her own absence? It doesn't track. And then there were the footprints. The constable's ledger notes them as erratic, but one surviving sketch reveals more. They double back on themselves, looping like someone chasing circles. Human footprints, yes, but the distances between them grew wider, almost like she'd been running. They stopped abruptly. No slide into water, no struggle in mud, just stopped. Imagine following a terrified woman's path and finding it severed mid-motion, as if the ground itself erased her. The villagers invented their own stories. Some claimed her dead husband returned for her, lantern guiding him across the vale. Others whispered of a rider in black, seen near the marsh the same week, a stranger on horseback, face obscured, never arriving at the inn, never stabling in town. But the most disturbing part, when the shepherd went back the next evening, he swore the lantern wasn't where they found it. He saw it swinging deeper in the marsh, too far to retrieve, bobbing in a mist that seemed to recoil from touch. He swore it was the same flame, the same light, but moving on its own. That was the spark, the first disturbance. A woman's scream, a trail that ended mid-panic, a lantern that refused to stay put. Whether Eleanor ran from something human or inhuman, the village began to murmur the same phrase. The widow hasn't left us. She's still searching. Here's where the story stops being quaint tragedy and starts festering like a wound that won't close. Because the villagers kept seeing her. Not Eleanor herself, of course. Not flesh and bone, but her lantern. Always her lantern. A farmhand hauling hay claimed it swayed along the hedgerows at midnight. Too steady to be a trick of light. A milkmaid saw it bobbing near the churchyard, pausing among the tombstones like it was choosing. And more than once, travelers on the turnpike swore it floated ahead of them, beckoning toward the marsh before vanishing in fog. But this isn't just ghost lore. People lied. People embellished. And if you strip away the supernatural gloss, you're left with something darker, a pattern. These sightings weren't random. They clustered near boundaries, fields, fences, crossroads, liminal places where one world bleeds into another. The marsh wasn't the only stage. Whoever or whatever was moving that lantern knew where to be seen. The constable didn't help. His report, thin as gruel, declared Eleanor likely perished of natural hazard. Translation: she was dead, case closed, stop asking. The church echoed that line, folding her disappearance into sermons about despair, warning parishioners against wandering in grief. But a few villagers wouldn't let it drop. Old Mrs. Harrow, who lived nearest the marsh, told her niece she heard 2 sets of footsteps that night. One heavy, deliberate, the other desperate, darting. She was ignored, partly because she was half-deaf, partly because nobody wanted to believe a predator stalked their countryside. And then there was the ledger, hidden in parish archives, only rediscovered a century later. It contained a single odd note dated 3 days after Eleanor vanished. Stranger in black, seen at market. Purchase rope, nails, salt, paid in foreign coin. Unaccounted. The handwriting trails off like the writer didn't want to admit they'd even noticed. So which is it? A ghost light, the grief-stricken imagination of a town strangled by superstition? Or was someone deliberately moving that lantern, parading it along hedges and crossroads to remind people she was gone? The cruelest possibility. Eleanor didn't just vanish. She was hunted, and her lantern became the hunter's trophy, brandished like a macabre calling card until it sank into legend. It's here the tale fractures. Was it despair or design? Did the widow walk into the dark, or was she driven into it? The villagers whispered one phrase like a curse whenever her lantern reappeared. She's not finished. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thought of all. This is where the whole thing turns into a carnival of half-baked logic and bureaucratic shrugs. If you expected sharp-eyed detectives combing fields for clues, forget it. The investigation into Eleanor Gray's disappearance was a pantomime. Thin ink on cheap paper, handled by men who thought widows were as replaceable as fence posts. The constable's notes are barely legible, but what we can scrape out is insulting. Widow, erratics and husbands passing. Lantern recovered. Presumed self-loss. No foul play suspected. That's it. Not a single mention of the footprints ending in mid-run. Not a single mention of the screams heard by more than one villager. Not even the courtesy of calling her death a suicide. Just self-loss, like she misplaced herself in the fog. But people talked, and their talk became theories. Some villagers whispered that Eleanor was taken by marsh spirits, lured to her death the way corpse candles were said to trick wanderers into bogs. Folklore as forensic explanation. Convenient, yes, but it doesn't explain the footprints looping in panic, or the lantern reappearing far from where it was found. Others suspected a flesh-and-blood culprit. The rider in black theory gained traction, a stranger on horseback, seen days before and after Eleanor's disappearance, buying rope, nails, salt, the inventory of either a craftsman or a killer. Witnesses swore his accent wasn't local. Some said Welsh, others Irish, one claimed French. In other words, he was foreign enough to be blamed and faceless enough to slip away. Then came the darker speculation that Eleanor didn't vanish alone. One rumor claimed she'd been secretly meeting a man after her husband's death. A lover? A blackmailer? Or someone who promised her escape. The theory paints her lantern as a signal, not a comfort. Light for a rendezvous. Extinguished when it went wrong. The problem is, no lover was ever identified. If he existed, he was either phantom or very, very good at disappearing. And then there's a fringe theory that gnaws at me most. That the lantern wasn't hers at all after the first night. That someone else picked it up, kept it burning, paraded it along boundaries. Not to haunt the village, but to taunt it. Evidence turned into theater. A trophy displayed to say, she's mine, she's gone, and you'll never prove a thing. The so-called investigation never asked these questions. It wasn't built to. Widows weren't worth the ink. But the villagers' whispers, fractured, contradictory, paranoid, might hold more truth than the constable's ledger. Because hidden in superstition and rumor is a pattern of human intent. If Eleanor Gray's lantern really burned beyond her last breath, then someone kept it alive. And that's not grief. That's possession. For months, the case sat stagnant, a smudge in the parish book, a whisper in taverns. Then the turning point hit like a hammer on glass. A farmer plowing near the hedgerows unearthed something tangled in the roots. Fabric, stiff with mud. A scrap of skirt, faded gray. Eleanor's gray. That single piece of cloth reignited everything. The constable returned, puffed with false importance, and declared it final proof the widow perished in the marsh. Case closed again, but the villagers didn't buy it, because clinging to the cloth was something else. A nail, blackened and bent, threaded to the fabric as though pinned deliberately. Not the kind of thing you pick up in marsh water. The kind of thing someone drives in. That detail never made it into the official report. The cloth was filed away, the nail discarded, but it trickled into rumor. And suddenly, the stories of the rider in black weren't quaint paranoia. They were knives at the throat of the constable's version. Then came the collapse. A miller's apprentice swore he'd seen the lantern again, this time swinging from a tree branch by the marsh. The village crowded to see, and sure enough, there it was, the same lantern, soot-stained, its handle bent in a way every villager remembered. Hanging, empty. It was no ghostly flame this time. It was a message. Someone had taken Eleanor's last possession and turned it into a macabre signal, as if to say, stop looking. Or worse, keep watching. People began to break down under the pressure. Mothers refused to let daughters walk alone at dusk. Farmers started carrying knives to the fields. And in the church records, you can see the shift. Sermons doubled down on obedience, on women staying silent and chaste, as if blaming Eleanor's disappearance on her own audacity to wander after dark. When the system can't solve a crime, it criminalizes the victim. The twist wasn't just the skirt or the nail or the lantern swinging like a corpse in effigy. The twist was the realization that someone was orchestrating this. Piece by piece, sighting by sighting, object by object. What looked like haunting might have been performance. And here's the breakdown. The village fractured. Half believed Eleanor's ghost was punishing them. The other half believed a man walked freely among them, using the lantern as his mask. But both groups agreed on one thing. They were being watched. If this were a tidy story, here's where the villain would stumble, the body would be found, and the widow's lantern would finally gut her out. But history doesn't like tidy endings. It prefers jagged ones, sharp enough to cut whoever dares to touch them. The resolution given at the time was insulting in its simplicity. The constable closed the case of good. His final entry, written in a hand so lazy it looks half-drunk, reads, Eleanor Gray, loss of marsh, no recovery. May God receive her. Done. Fold the ledger. Move on. The law buried her without ever having to find her. But the questions never stop circling, like crows that know there's meat somewhere beneath the soil. Who was a rider in black? The stranger who bought rope and nails with foreign coin? Was he a passing laborer? Or the architect of Eleanor's disappearance? Why did no one track him? Why was he allowed to vanish into the mist as cleanly as Eleanor did? Why was the lantern seen for months, sometimes swinging from a tree, sometimes bobbing along hedgerows, always in motion, never claimed? If it was simply lost property, someone would have pocketed it, used it, sold it. Instead, it reappeared only at night, only in ways that deepened the fear. And the nail, that single, bent nail threaded through Eleanor's skirt, an accident or a message? Was someone mocking her, pinning her even in absence? There's another, quieter question nobody wanted to say aloud. What if it wasn't a stranger at all? What if it was someone from the village? Someone who knew her routines, who knew she clung to that lantern every night. A neighbor, a friend, maybe even someone who shared her grief too closely. If that were true, then every whispered sighting of the lantern wasn't just haunting. It was a reminder that the killer was still among them, watching the fear he had planted. The official story is, Eleanor walked into the marsh, swallowed by mud and despair. But the true story? It's scattered in contradictions, buried in superstition, dripping from every rumor the constable refused to write down. And that's the problem. The truth was never lost. It was ignored, The disappearance of Eleanor Gray didn't vanish with her body. It metastasized, weaving itself into the marrow of the village until it became impossible to separate memory from superstition. Generations grew up under the glow or the threat of her lantern. Children were warned. Don't follow the light, or the widow will take you. Lovers dared each other to walk the hedgerows at night, whispering that a true kiss would banish the lantern's glow. Farmers swore they saw it swinging before a season of poor harvest, interpreting it as an omen of punishment. The legend bled into every crack of rural life until Eleanor herself was gone, replaced by symbol, by curse, by cautionary tale. And institutions? They used her story like a cudgel. The church folded into morality plays. A widow strays, a widow is claimed. Women were told to keep to their hearths, to stay away from darkness, to accept dependence as virtue. Eleanor's fate became propaganda, reinforcing obedience with the terror of vanishing. Her voice was smothered, replaced with sermons that blamed her absence on her audacity. But the other legacy, the one that never made it into sermons, was suspicion. The rider in black became a template for the bogeyman, invoked whenever a stranger came to town. Entire generations grew up scanning the horizon for a faceless horseman, the kind of silhouette you could project your worst fears onto. Foreigners, wanderers, even harmless tinkers were chased off because they fit the mold of a phantom no one had ever caught. And then there's the relic itself, the lantern. By the late 19th century, villagers still claimed to see it, though now it was more often said to hover near crossroads and marshes. One family swore it appeared in their barn on the night their patriarch died. Another claimed it followed a girl home until she collapsed in fits. Each story tangled fact and myth until nobody could be sure if the lantern was real or just a shared hallucination of collective guilt. But here's the jagged truth. Eleanor Gray may have been erased by her society, dismissed by its law, and twisted by its folklore, yet her disappearance left scars deeper than a corpse could. Her legacy wasn't justice. It was paranoia, misogyny, and a myth that punished women for daring to exist outside the light of a man. In other words, the widow's lantern still burns, just not the way you think. Here's the part that keeps me awake. The last diary scrapped. The one found stuffed into the lantern itself years later, when a farm boy dragged the rusted thing out of the marsh and cracked it open. Scorched, half-rotted, barely legible, but the words still bite. He said the light is not for finding a way. It is for keeping me seen. I am to burn until I am gone. Read that again. Not grief, not despair. A testimony, a witness statement in miniature, smuggled inside her only possession, hidden in fire and soot. She didn't carry that lantern for comfort. She carried it because someone demanded she keep it lit, so she could be tracked, so she couldn't slip away. That changes everything. The lantern wasn't Eleanor's beacon. It was her leash. So when villagers saw it bobbing across hedgerows, swinging from trees, burning where no one should be, maybe they weren't seeing a ghost. Maybe they were seeing the afterimage of control, a performance orchestrated by whoever held her fate, using her light as both spectacle and warning. And isn't that the most horrific resolution of all? That Eleanor Gray, erased in life, erased in law, lived on only as a prop in her captor's theater. A lantern weaponized into folklore. A woman's silence transformed into a tale told by those who failed her. We'll never know who the rider in black was. We'll never know what hand drove that nail through her skirt, or who placed a lantern so neatly on stone. But we do know this. Every time her story was retold, every time her lantern was invoked to frighten children into obedience, the original crime deepened. She was murdered twice, once in flesh, once in memory. And that is the true haunting. Not the lantern swaying in fog, not the ghost of a widow wandering the marsh, but the way a woman's suffering became folklore, morality tale, ghost story, anything but justice. the widow's lantern still burns. Not in fields, not in marshes, but in the silence around every unsolved disappearance. Every woman written out of history with a shrug and a sermon. The flame flickers, whispering, "You looked, but you did not see." Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.